I love Port Melbourne. It's a beautiful area to live in. I grew up here. My mother still lives in Albert Park. I had a very happy childhood. Everything was in walking distance. The shops, the beach. There were lots of things we liked to do, like catch the tram to the city or walk to the beach for an ice cream on a hot summer's day. There was a real community feeling living here. All our neighbours knew each other.
My family first arrived, well, my great-grandfather did in 1866. He was a seaman and he was 17. And he did the round trip back to London for the next 10 years because obviously they were bringing people to the goldfields and migrants out to Port Melbourne. So we've been here a long time. So Mum and Dad met at the Masonic Hall in Liarded Street and they married. And Dad bought a house in Garden City, one of the bank houses. Port Melbourne has changed in the last 20 years, but that was natural because a lot of the older people have died off, and so I guess the next generation has moved in anyway. The changes, it used to be so busy at Princess Pier and Station Pier. Now, when I go for a walk with my neighbour who says, let's go for a walk and see if the piers are still there. Well, the bank houses were made, I suppose they were social housing. They were made to enable people who worked in the area to live in the area and remain in the area. But unfortunately, the bank houses now have a different focus, or people's idea of them are, and they are considered too expensive for people who live in the area to buy. So I know my father bought our house for £1,000 and they took more than 25 years to pay it off. The houses now that I live in are between 1.5 million to 2 million, and it just seems ridiculous. Initially, with the development of Port Melbourne and the large high-rise places, I felt very resentful. I thought, when people say, isn't Port Melbourne lovely now? I say it always was. Every corner almost has apartments on it. And I think, I don't know whether I like this anymore, but I am used to it now. And a lot of people, though, can't afford to live in Port Melbourne anymore, and they have to go elsewhere, unfortunately, because they can't afford the prices. I wasn't aware of any conflict when Kine Place was being built at all. I don't have a problem with social housing. I think it's necessary to provide people with a home. Public housing can enable people to live in the area and also to bring a mix of people to the area rather than just having people who can afford a certain price of a house.
In recent years, there has been a lot of changes and rapid growth in the area. Along with these changes, accommodation became too expensive. Cost of living rose. I moved away from the area and from my family and friends. I became aware that I was eligible for community housing. So now I have returned to where my home is. I live in community housing at Kine Place, Port Melbourne. It is wonderful to be back home in my familiar surroundings, and I love my home. I mean, essentially, I've got no financial stress. That was the hard thing about living in today's world with cost of living skyrocketing. And everyone here has no financial stress. That's the relief, and we've got our places for the rest of our lives if we want them. I made a lot of friends over the years growing up in the area, and many still live here locally. I became a graphic artist. I'm also a part of group art exhibitions once a year, and have been doing so for the past 7 years. I love Bay Street with all the cafes and shops. Two of my favourite places are Mr. White Homeware Store and the Grand Bliss Cafe.
When I first came, it was cheap, and they were mostly simple houses, little terraces, maximum 3-bedroom, very few double stories, very few brick. I remember we used to still have the milk delivered by horse and cart. So it was very different landscape to today. Today there's much more wealthy homes, much more double-storey townhouses. There weren't any townhouses. The type of people in Port Melbourne have changed quite a lot. They're a lot more affluent. A lot of people couldn't afford to buy into this area nowadays, particularly if they were older Port Melbourne people. They wouldn't have had the money. Like, my kids can't afford to live in this area. There's always been a need for social housing, and I'm a very strong advocate of it. Being a poor area, it was also a very rough area. Regarding Kime Place, I don't remember it being built. I do remember there was a car park there, and then next time I looked there was a building. And a very attractive building, I thought. Very clever use of colour, and the architecture was quite different and interesting. As soon as I come back to Port Melbourne, I just feel, great, this is home. This is where my mob is.
The business that we run here is a family business, been established since 1975. Elegant Slacks, menswear tailoring. The main aim was to establish a business group that represents the interests of all the traders and business owners of Port Melbourne. Huge changes in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up. You could fire a cannon down the middle of the street here and it was that quiet. Things changed. Apartments came up, people moved in. There is that huge influx of the younger, yuppie sort of culture, couples, newborn babies. Well, everyone loves the area of Port Melbourne. I mean, it's been described as a city living by the bay, so I think everyone's pretty much wants to be part of that lifestyle. So, social housing was existent previously. It's probably taking on a newer form now. There's also the element where those that can't afford to buy in the area have certainly got a place to come and live and shop and support local businesses too. Yeah, we actively encourage participation and involvement of all in the community. Initially, Kime Place, when it was mooted to be developed for social housing, there was a bit of reluctance and a bit of, because initially we had, as a traders association, had paid for that area to be parking for our customers. There was a little anger, but once it was determined that it would be established and built, then we took it on board and we accepted it as part of community Kyne Place is visually stimulating. If they can all take a leaf out of that book, it'll be fantastic, particularly the ones in this area in Port Melbourne.
And I think the general stigma of it being called a rooming house was the initial argument that all the residents in the surrounding area had. Because when people think of rooming houses, they think of drug addicts, alcoholics, whatever, that are struggling. Well, we actually have members of the public photograph the front of the building because it's spectacular. It also won an architecture award after it was built, and it's an absolutely beautiful place to live. We have exceptional views and beautiful apartments. So although I can't afford to buy or rent in the area, through community housing, I can now live here permanently, and it feels like home.